Warning, the following video is for educational purposes only. In 1945, Hitler and Mussolini were dead. World War II is over and Europe is saved? Not necessarily, because they were split in half, causing tensions in Europe and the rest of the world. These tensions would grow and eventually cause the war called the Cold War. The Cold War was an economic and political war against the USA and the Union of Socialist Soviet Republic, or the USSR. This war would introduce nuclear bombs and the threat to end humanity. It was a very long and dangerous war. The fate of the world lay in the hands of the two superpowers. After the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world was introduced to the scariest and most powerful bomb the world has ever seen, the nuclear bomb. The USA was the only superpower at the time, until 1949, when the USSR launched its first atomic bomb, named First Light. The world was increasingly getting to a point of the end of humanity. You may ask, how did the Soviet Union get the atomic bomb? The Soviets had sent spies to the US, and they gathered information. They were even in the Manhattan Project, which is a secret project the US constructed to build the first atomic bomb. After they gathered enough information, the Soviets constructed their own bomb. The world would now have its second superpower. After World War II, all the countries got together to make a successor to the League of Nations, the United Nations. The United Nations is a global peace organization whose goal is to assure peace in the world. The UN is not going to prevent conflicts, but from starting a World War III. The organization was formed on October 24th, 1945, and currently has about 197 members. The UN has prevented many conflicts and tragedies, such as the hole in the ozone layer. Another association that was formed was called NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, is an organization that all the members will protect each other. NATO was formed on April 4th, 1949, 74 years ago. This was an organization was mainly to contain the spread of communism. NATO is still around today with 31 members, with the newest being Finland. Even with Turkey's aggression towards Finland joining, they still did, so most likely Sweden will follow. Following countries are now in NATO today: Albania, Belgium, Bulgaria, Canada, Croatia, Czechia, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Montenegro, the Netherlands, North Macedonia, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Turkey, United Kingdom, and the United States. After World War II, the world was in a state of destruction. Europe was split by the USSR, France, Great Britain, and the USA. The USSR turned all of its territory or satellite states into communist countries. These countries included Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and eastern part of Germany. The USA, France, Great Britain will unite their claims of West Germany. They will also split Berlin, the capital of Germany, into two. The communists will try to keep the people in, which doesn't make much sense considering their anthem has "Long live the people, united and free." The Soviets soon realized that people in the east side of Berlin and Germany can just walk into the free West Germany and escaped. That was a problem will continue. The west side of Germany is a democracy, and the east side of Germany is communist. In the east side of Germany, there's Berlin, which I've already stated, which is the capital of Germany. And as I stated again already, that's been split by the Allies and the USSR. So, now, in the middle of the USSR, or the USSR's claim on West Germany, there's just a safe haven for all the communists to walk in. So, this will lead to a blockade of Germans leaving communist into democracy. Over about 2 million Germans, or communists I guess you could say, leave and go just through Berlin and straight just fly the planes and just, go all over the place to democracy. Of course, Stalin didn't really like that, so he blockaded it, and a lot of people starved, not to death, but just starved inside of East Berlin. So the USA and its allies had to airlift supplies over through planes and dropped it into Berlin. This would last through June 24th through 1948 through May 12th of 1949. Eventually, the Berlin Wall is a wall built to divide Berlin. The wall was built on August 13th, 1961. The wall was built to keep the communists in, so they could not go into democracy. Within a couple of hours, it was just a fence. After a while, it grew into a giant concrete wall. This wall was to keep people in, so whenever people tried to escape, they were shot. On November 9th, 1989, under Gorbachev's reign, the wall fell. In other words, the main contender for people wanting to escape communism is the Marshall Plan, which is a plan the U.S. and some other countries will donate approximately $13.3 billion to restore Western Europe. The Marshall Plan worked. France, West Germany, Turkey, Greece, and Great Britain were swiftly going to be restored. The East was not being restored. You could visually see the difference within a West thriving city and the East torn down town. The following years will be tense and mainly filled with ever-growing tension. The Korean War was fought in Korea. It was started June 1950. It was a war of communists and capitalism. The North Koreans were aided with the Soviet supplies, and the North Koreans attacked past the 38th parallel and quickly and swiftly advanced to Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea. The South Koreans were being obliterated. The North Koreans pushed all the way to Busan, which is a city in South Korea. The UN mobilizes their forces, mostly U.S. forces, and attacked. The UN were led by General MacArthur. The UN pushed almost all the way to the Chinese border. The North Koreans were just about to be defeated, then all of a sudden, thousands of Chinese crossed the border and pushed back to the UN. Eventually, the conflict comes to a stalemate and ends with an armistice. This conflict is commonly known as the Forgotten War, and still technically is going on today. The conflict is now over, and the world is at rest, right? Wrong! The world has not seen anything yet. The world was about to have the scariest time ever, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a crisis that happened when the U.S. found out that the USSR was putting nuclear weapons in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted through October 16, 1962, through October 29, 1962. The U.S. was already on its toes once the USSR obtained nukes. But with the addition of Cuba having nukes, it got even crazier. The USSR was also on its toes about the nukes, so it was extra careful. The whole thing started when the U.S. sent U-2 jets over Cuba and got pictures of missiles. President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba so the USSR would not be able to transport any more nukes over. This tension had everyone on their toes, for if one thing went wrong, the whole world could go into nuclear war, which would probably end humanity. The Soviets were high in command, and Kennedy met to set the crisis. They agreed that if the U.S. were to take its warheads out of Italy and Turkey, they would remove the nukes from Cuba. The Soviets had not necessarily listened because a top-secret mission was put out for a nuclear warhead submarine to swim around Cuba. One of these submarines were caught by the U.S. battleship and were caught in a standoff. The standoff ended when the U.S. fired depth missiles and that dealt no damage. They were just to get the submarines to surface. The captain was going to fire the nuclear missile. The missile warhead was the size of the bomb at Hiroshima, but was stopped by one of the people who had agreed to actually fire the missile. The guy's name was, sorry if I get this wrong, Vasily catastrophic Ark-5. He refused to launch the missile and saved the world. After the world almost ended the continuation of the Cold War, the USSR and the USA have been in a nuclear arms race. The nuclear arms race was a race between the USSR and the USA to get most nuclear or atomic bombs. The reason behind it is simply because the country with the most nukes was the strongest superpower. Definition of superpower is a country with nuclear or atomic bombs. This conflict lasted until 1949 through 1991. This race was very similar to the space race, for instead of the amount of bombs, it is a distance in space. This conflict would be a very scary time in history, for where the world could end at any point. The Cold War was still not over. The USA and the USSR were racing again, but this time it wasn't as scary. This race was called the space race. The space race was a race put the first man on the moon and launch the first satellite into space. The USSR got a sweet victory with launching the first spacecraft ever, Sputnik. Sputnik had no humans aboard, but was still a great success. The USA had a great victory when it launched the all-too-familiar Apollo 11 into space, landing the first humans on the moon. The USA had a fear that communism is going to spread, like it tried to in the Korean War. And it was kind of right. There is a French colony named Vietnam, and it wants freedom. The north side is communist, and the south side is democracy. The new conflict that is going to start is called the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, as most of you know, was a long and brutal war for the Americans. Now, how did the Vietnam start, you may ask? Back before World War II, France established a colony in Asia, which included Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They united the three countries and called it Indochina. Vietnam just got out of Chinese control. The Vietnamese were not happy with the fact of a new ruler. Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese naturalist who wanted Vietnam to be free. Ho tried to collaborate with the U.S., but eventually had other plans for the fate of Vietnam. Ho eventually turned into a communist, where he would gain the trust of the Vietnamese people. This sudden revolt scared the U.S. and triggered the domino theory. The domino theory is a thing where the U.S. believes that if one country falls to communism, others will follow. The U.S. wanted to keep communism out of Asia, especially after China became communist. The French did not want to leave their colony, and only half of it, the South, wanted to stay. French forces were stationed in Vietnam and fought the North. It was very unsuccessful, so they agreed to leave the country in half and have an election. The election against Ho Chi Minh and Ngo Dinh Diem, who was Democratic. You probably can guess who the U.S. was hoping to win. The U.S. was hoping that Ngo Dinh Diem would win, but that was looking ever increasingly less with Ho's popularity. Eventually, Ngo Dinh Diem shut down the votes and decided to keep Vietnam in two. The North Vietnamese didn't like that, so they invaded. The USA aided South Vietnam with supplies and troops to train their troops. This went on for a while, and then, in the Gulf of Tonkin, on early August 1964, 2 U.S. destroyers stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam radioed that they had been fired upon by North Vietnamese forces. This would give the U.S. stationed and active personnel in Vietnam to protect those troops. The troops would end up fighting them, thus causing the Vietnam War. This was not actually a war, it was a special military operation. This was originally called the Indochina War. During the war, North Vietnamese were called Viet Cong. The Viet Cong would dig tunnels to shoot out, and if they could crawl deeper, to get to safety. And if an unexpected American wandering into the tunnels, they would be shot, fall in a hole, and possibly even bitten by some type of animal, like a snake, scorpion, etc. That the Viet Cong would place there. This would be a very brutal fighting, and with the morale from the soldiers down and the Americans wanting their soldiers back, the U.S. left the war. The war was still fought by the South, but with pace, the Viet Cong took over the entirety of Vietnam. Now, the end of the Vietnam War, this U.S. until 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. As I mentioned earlier, it was a giant action, and when it fell, it took the Soviets with them. In 1991, the last member of the Soviet Union was Kazakhstan. But that only lasted 3 days before it officially collapsed on December 25th, 1991. The USSR was no more. Today, all the communist nations in the world are Cuba, China, Cambodia, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam. The world is at peace for now, and no major wars have happened.